sitting at his table, illuminated by a small bedside lamp. Robert Francis pored over a map, jotting down notes each time his eyes fell onto some point of interest. It was 10:30 p.m., and he reckoned that if he set off at 6 in the morning, he would be able to avoid the early traffic and catch the first train to Milngavie before cycling there, making to Aberfoyle village in a couple of hours. His itinerary was set, and he was filled with excitement at the thought of finally being on holiday. It had been 11 months since he had so much as shaken off one day from his work, so the thought of spending 8 whole days cycling through the Scottish wilderness with only his backpack and tent for company was frankly exhilarating. He owned a number of bikes, but for this adventure, he would take his favorite and most trusted one, with a custom-paid job reading Rob in large white letters across a frame of black. This was a bike which had never failed him. No bumps, no bruises, not so much as a punctured tire. In the morning, Robert woke with excitement, starting the day with purpose, negotiating the little traffic there was in the city with glee. Before he knew it, he was off of the train in Milngavie and making his way along the quiet countryside towards Aberfoyle. Scottish summers are notoriously unpredictable, and it was colder than Robert had expected, but he did not care. As he made his way across the open countryside, passing the occasional car or rural household, a smile crept across his face. Cycling was his passion, and Robert was in his element. A couple of hours passed as sparse, yet rolling green hills soon gave way to a more imposing and altogether impressive setting. Slight hills soon became domineering mountains. Pockets of woodland soon gave way to thick and visually impenetrable forests, and wide open roads soon made way for the narrower and less trodden counterparts. It was not long before the welcome sight of the village of Aberfoyle came into view, flanked on one side by a steep incline dotted with picturesque cottages, and on the other side, a wide open plain stretching out towards a mountain range in the distance. A childish excitement grew in the pit of Robert's stomach. Aberfoyle was the last evidence of humanity which he wished to see for the next 8 days, and on leaving it behind, he would truly be alone, able to relax in the serene beauty of the Scottish countryside. It was now on to Queen Elizabeth Park, one of Scotland's largest nature reserves, and into the true wilderness which it contained. After stretching his legs on the unusually deserted Aberfoyle main street, Robert embarked on the last leg of his journey for the day. Within minutes, he was out of the small, innocuous town and into the unknown. For the past 3 months, he had been in a quandary about where to go on his adventure. But when he passed over an old stone bridge, with a babbling stream underneath, like 1,000 voices whispering for attention, and found himself face to face with a forest which covered the hills, mountains, and valleys like a blanket for as far as the eye could see, he knew he had made the right decision. A dirt road cut through the labyrinth of trees, and it occurred to Robert that as he cycled further into the reserve, the sun seemed to diminish with each mile, blocked by the huge pine trees on either side, as if light itself was an unwelcome visitor. By 6 o'clock, the sun was dipping toward a line of craggy mountains on the horizon. It was time for Robert to find a suitable place to camp for the night. He continued onward, struggling over uneven hills and patches of wet mud, scanning his surroundings for a suitable location to camp in. Finally, he spotted a small clearing in the forest, not far from the road. Clambering through some thick underfoot and entangled bushes, Robert managed to haul his bike through the tree line and then into the clearing. It was a small pocket of grass, and several fallen trees were spread across the area. Trees which Robert assumed had created the clearing in the first place. After finding a small flat patch of grass, he set his tent up for the night, gathering some dry wood nearby, which he gleefully turned into a campfire with the aid of some lighter fluid and matches. Building fires was one of Robert's favorite parts of camping in remote areas. He often thought there was something of the arsonist about himself, but that was a fact he kept only for his trips into the wild. And in any case, he loved nature and was always careful not to harm it. Night fell, and, unimpeded by the false light of man, the stars shone bright and bold. After a few hours of sitting next to the warm glow of the fire, Robert reluctantly turned in for the night, excited by the prospect of another day's adventure in the morning. In the early hours, the fire still smoldered, and Robert felt refreshed and rested, more so than he had done for many years. Packing up his belongings, and making sure the fire was extinguished, he set off once again. It had rained slightly during the night, but thankfully, the road was relatively dry. After cycling in for another hour, Robert noticed a change in the landscape. It had become more unkempt, less constrained. The trees seemed closer together, and any occasional gaps in the forest scenery were filled by clearings and small fields, which had obviously been left unattended for countless years. Robert realized that he had traveled far enough into the forest, that he was now out of reach of even the park rangers, who would normally maintain such a place. It seemed as though beyond this point, the land had been neglected by its caretakers, for some reason. The thought that even those familiar with the wilderness were afraid to tread there flirted with his attention momentarily, before being quickly dismissed as a flight of fancy. The sky grew gray as the day wore on, and it was clear that the rain of a substantial volume was well on its way. The sky grew gray as the day wore on, and it was clear that rain of a substantial volume was well on its way. After pushing his bike up a steep incline, which he felt was too uneven to cycle on, Robert reached its peak, revealing a landscape which opened up, sprawling forward between pockets of woodland and still, stagnant pools of water slumbering in a deep-set valley below, which stretched across the land for miles. It was populated by sparse areas of long, vibrant grass, which in places gave way to wandering boundary of the forest. With rain imminent, Robert decided that he would set up camp early in a wide circle of grass he could see at the foot of the hill. Not half an hour later, he was there. The tent was up, and all that was left was to gather some firewood. It was important to get a fire going as quickly as possible, as the Scottish midges, a type of fly that feeds on blood, were out in force, and the smoke would help disperse them. The only problem was that Robert had picked up a camping spot dominated by more so grass, bushes, and shrubs and trees. He would have to venture out across the valley for a little while and gather from one of the wooded areas nearby. A collection of pine and fir trees, which seemed to form an isolated island of woodland about a half-mile across, was close enough to his camp, and after 10 or 15 minutes trudging through the long green grass, occasionally sinking his foot unwittingly into remnants of a marshy bog below, Robert found himself at the edge of the woods. Its boundary was dominated by older trees, which had long since withered, covered by thick, brown, hanging moss, nature's own burial shroud. The broken trunks of once beautiful and majestic pines and sycamores littered the ground, open and rotting from the inside, not unlike a poor wounded animal. It occurred to Robert that these woods seemed somehow out of place. The trees did not belong to the landscape as others did. The long grass, which characterized the entire area, seemed to thin out and change from a healthy, natural green color to a morbid yellow-brown. As this thought ruminated, accompanied by an increasing sense of unexplainable dread, Robert realized that he was looking at a large, dead ring of grass, which followed the tree line perfectly, encircling that pocket of woodland, as if marking the limits of a tomb. On their own, in a forgotten part of the world, many would have been cautious of such a sight. But Robert quickly shook off his initial sense of vigilance. finding the area to be an intriguing natural occurrence, and with a bold stride stepped over the woodland threshold into the dim light within. On the forest floor, he could see many relics of past trees lying on the ground, but the wood was soaked through, as if it had laid for countless years at the bottom of a river, and Robert rationalized that dead wood further into the area would be drier, as the canopy above grew increasingly thicker with each step, sheltering below from the rain. Scanning the floor, Robert looked up, and suddenly realized that he had wandered quite far into the woodland interior. Indeed, while it was daylight outside, the woodland trees were now blotting the sun from the sky, and if he had not known better, he would have sworn it was dusk. At last, he found a collection of broken branches and logs which were dry. Robert knew this was as far as he should go, as it was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate through the trees, which seemed to be growing closer together, their branches often interlinked and touching as if trying to keep those inside from escaping. What a silly thought, Robert smirked to himself. It had started to rain, and although he could hear the drops of water pelting off the leaves above, his surroundings were perfectly dry. It made sense to make his way back and get a fire started as soon as possible, because once everything was wet, it would prove increasingly difficult to do so. He quickly gathered the last of the wood up in his arms, but just as he was turned to leave and follow his own tracks on the pine-covered floor out of those unnerving woods, something caught his eye. Several feet away, obscured by a ring of trees particularly close to one another, appeared to be a strange arrangement of stones on the ground. Robert, being Robert, he just had to investigate. After clawing his way through a net of branches, he found himself staring at what suspiciously looked like a grave. Hundreds of uneven gray stones, the size of a fist, and some substantially larger, had been piled on top of one another, about 3 feet wide, 7 feet long, and a couple of feet off the ground. It looked as though a mourner had marked the resting place of a body. A shudder crept up Robert's spine, as he momentarily experienced a feeling as of being watched. He soon abandoned this frightened state, when he noticed that lying around the stones was a collection of randomly scattered belongings. Several empty beer cans lay strewn on the floor. A jumper covered in rotting leaves sat on the ground, while his sleeping bag, scraps of newspaper, and even some old food cans betrayed the grave for what it really was: someone's campsite. Robert breathed a sigh of relief, and surmised from his surroundings that a few students had probably come here in the summer, got caught by the rain, and moved into the woods to remain dry. The stones were probably just placed there out of boredom, or even as a prank to creep out any passerby in the future. University summers were really great, Robert thought, casting a fleeting eye back to memories of summer trips with his friends. One thing about that stone configuration, however, intrigued him. Sticking out between two plain gray rocks on the side of the pile was a stone which appeared to be marked differently from the rest. Triangular in shape, it was wider than a human hand, smooth in places, and not dissimilar to black marble, tapering off to a dull point at one end. Before he really considered it with any degree of scrutiny, Robert dropped the firewood, bent over, and tugged on the stone. It felt polished and cold in his hands, but it seemed to not wish to leave its home, wedged as it was so tightly amongst the other rocks. Growing slightly exasperated, Robert wrapped both his hands around the stone, and finally, with an exerted shudder backwards, it was free. Staring at it intently, it looked suspiciously like an ancient axe head. Whether it was or not, Robert was not qualified to answer, but it certainly looked like a man-made object, and he could see chisel marks along its side. Perhaps the previous campers found it nearby, and used the rock in their construction without knowing of its significance. Robert was excited by the prospect, and knew instantly that his return home, he would ask a friend of his. Robert was excited by the prospect, and knew instantly that on his return home, he would ask a friend of his. who had studied archaeology at a university, whether it was what he suspected it was. After examining the object for some time, Robert was reminded by the sound of rain above that he really should make his way back to his campsite. Pocketing the stone, he bent over to pick up the firewood, but as he did, he heard a noise. It appeared as though one of the stones on the pile had slid off and landed on the ground. A creeping sense of unease slowly started to exert itself upon Robert's nerves. He quickly picked up the firewood, leaving the rest of the stones unmoved, and began to make his way back. With every step, something deep within himself was telling Robert that he was no longer alone, and in fact, he was being followed by someone in the woods. But with every glance backwards, he could see nothing. A few times, he even fancied that he had heard the sound of twigs and pines cracking underfoot, but again, no one was there. Breathing a sigh of relief, the tree line came into view, and Robert was filled with delight, knowing that in a few moments he would be back out in the open. But just before he reached the periphery of the woods, he heard a crack again. This time it was definite. It was louder than before, more pronounced, and accompanied by the hairs on the back of his head rising in unison. He was convinced that someone was standing just a few feet behind, staring at him. Caught between the fear of knowing and the fear of not knowing, Robert finally turned around slowly. Yes, there it was. He saw it. Only for a moment, but he saw it. A shoulder or arm, something disappearing behind a tree nearby. Robert's mouth grew dry, making it difficult to swallow, and his heart started to thud deep within his chest. He began to backpedal slowly, hoping that he would not trip on an unseen root or weed on the floor, leaving him vulnerable on the ground. With each step, the forest grew lighter, and as he neared its edge, the light from outside bathed in its interior in a bluish hue. He did not take his eyes off the large sycamore trunk where that shadowy figure seemed to be hiding, not for one moment. It was peculiar, but an overpowering sense of safety out in the open dominated his thoughts. Normally, a person feels exposed and vulnerable in the open wilderness, but not Robert, at least not in that situation. As he edged slowly towards the grassy plain outside, the subtle, foreboding sound of leaves rustling and swaying almost in anger progressed into a crescendo of noise. But there was no wind to gust, no breeze to disturb. There was only one conclusion to be reached. Something was moving. And then he was outside, out of the woods, away from whoever had been following. No, not following, stalking him. Robert was not a superstitious man. You could not afford to be when camping alone in such remote locations, as the mind tends to play tricks, twisting the benign sounds of nature into something much more malevolent. But regardless, he did not wish to stay around long enough to find out who his unwanted companion in the woods had been. Dropping all but the sturdiest piece of wood, which Robert reckoned would make a good makeshift weapon, he ran as fast as he could toward his own camp, all the while glancing back at that strange island of trees, surrounded by dead grass. But nothing emerged from within it. Arriving at his tent, out of breath and agitated, Robert packed up his belongings as quickly as possible, carrying his bike up a hill and back into the dirt path. Waiting not one moment longer, he cycled hard and fast, hoping to put as much distance between himself and that place and its strange resident before finding somewhere safer and more welcoming to camp. The road was now nothing but a single track of mud, which covered Robert in a shower of dirt every time his bike sloshed through an uneven depression in the ground. The weather was bitter, unusually so at that time of year, and the rain, accompanied now by a freezing wind, battered his face, making each foot of progress feel like 100. Robert tried to continue onwards for as long as he could, hoping to leave the necessity of making camp until the last usable ray of sunlight. But after a couple of hours, the skies opened further, and the rain came down in sheets. He had to find shelter, and quick. Robert concluded that he had put at least 15 or so miles of winding, difficult track between himself and that bizarre coven of trees. Regardless of whether it was far enough or not, it was simply impossible to continue due to the elements. On the left-hand side of the path, there was a rather steep drop, which led down into a large field, but it would not provide the shelter Robert knew he required. To his right was a humble gradient of grass, which rose up into another wood. Following his strange experience from before, some hesitancy did present itself to him, but he again dismissed this as preposterous, and after pulling his bike up through the grass, he entered the forest. The torrential rain filtered through the tree canopy, and it took a while before Robert could locate a suitable spot to camp. Finding a large bush under several tightly knit fir trees, he pitched his tent there, as the area remained relatively protected from the horrible weather outside in the open. Using some dried roots, grass, and twigs from the forest floor, he was able to start a small campfire, which allowed him to cook some food while raising his spirits. Night began to close in. As the wind and rain diminished, the sound of sausages sizzling in a frying pan on the open fire provided the first sense of well-being and comfort that he had experienced since the morning. Thinking over his experience in the woods, Robert began to rationalize the event. He had found various belongings in there: a sleeping bag, clothes, food, and beer cans. It was obvious now that he had just disturbed a fellow camper. Someone who, no doubt, became frightened upon seeing another human being wandering around the campsite in the middle of nowhere. That must have been it. The man, and he was reasonably sure that it was a man from the little he had seen of him, probably hid behind a tree because he was simply scared or unnerved. Robert relaxed into a sigh of relief. But just as he did so, he slipped his hand into his jacket pocket. Touching its cold black surface, he had completely forgotten about the unusual stone he had picked up from that collection of oddly arranged rocks. Removing it from his jacket pocket, and observing it in the low, red light of the campfire, Robert was certain that it had been shaped by human hands. It felt old, ancient even, but he would wait to contact his archaeologist friend before getting his hopes up too much. He would have to admit, though, that the idea of finding a relic from the past was something which thrilled him deeply. Since he was a child, he was always obsessed by hidden or undiscovered history, which perhaps explained his fascination with exploring the Scottish countryside, a land steeped in stories and myths of strange and forgotten peoples. Above all else, he hoped it was of Pictish origin, that mysterious indigenous people who vanished without a trace over 1,000 years ago, something which historians still ponder and puzzle over. Of course, in all probability, it was a modern replica, but the romantic side of Robert's personality hoped that it was so much more, and enjoyed entertaining that hope. As he stared at the relic, something unusual began to filter into his awareness. Something different. Above the crackling sound of the fire, the now subtle wind, and occasional rustling of a woodland animal nearby, came a noise. It was distant. How far Robert could not tell, but it echoed out through the ridges and valleys nearby, scattering through the trees in the dark. It repeated again and again, with only a moment's pause between utterances. It was an utterance of some description. An animal, perhaps? Robert could not identify it. Despite his impressive knowledge of local wildlife, the sound possessed strange characteristics of a creature unknown to him. In some ways, it was reminiscent of a bird of prey. Parts high-pitched and shrieking, but under this lay a painful, wretched noise, more akin to that of a fox crying in the night looking for its young. That was it exactly. It sounded like it was looking for something. For the next 3 hours, Robert lay awake, listening to the screeching noise ebb and flow as whatever was producing it moved closer, then further away. As he eventually drifted towards sleep, the thoughts occurred to him that the movement of the sound was not unlike that of a search party, yelling and shouting, looking for someone lost in the wilderness, following a distinct search pattern. In the cold light of day, the noise was gone, and while Robert had accepted that what had scared him yesterday was simply a timid camper, cautious of a stranger nearby, he still could not shake the feeling of impending dread deep from the pit of his stomach. The day passed quickly, and while Robert made good progress, he did not do so with the delight he had previously exhibited. Something toxic lay in his mind, just outside of his awareness, something which suffocated his spirits. That night again, he camped in a clearing, and yet again, the same horrible shriek screamed out across the wilderness, looking for something lost, something precious, shrieked of one so different from the night before. It was closer.